Coming up next on Chicano, the history of the Mexican-American civil rights movement. In 1965, Mexican-American farm workers were fed up with inhumane treatment and poor working conditions.
Come on up, brothers. We are waiting for you.
They walked off many California fields and refused to pick grapes. Led by Cesar Chavez, a new union changed the way the world looked at Chicanos in America. Relive the story of the struggle in the fields.
September 1965. Mexican-American farm workers walked off the fields and refused to pick grapes at many California vineyards. They were tired of exploitation and inhumane treatment. They demanded the same opportunities that other Americans had: a living wage, education for their children, decent housing, to live without fear. They staked their claim by shouting huelga, the Spanish word for strike. It soon became the battle cry for the Chicano movement. The San Joaquin Valley is a fertile agricultural region stretching 500 miles through the center of California. In the early 1960s, migrant farm workers who picked crops in these rich fields knew only misery and poverty.
Mr. Pena, how much do you earn a year?
Oh, well, about $2,500 a year. So.
How much education have you had?
None.
Never been to school?
Well, yeah, a few years and so.
Can you read?
Not too good.
How much have you been getting for a day's work?
Only $2.
$2 a day?
Yes.
You have a little boy. Would you like him to be a farm worker?
No, sir. I've been working all my life in fields, and I don't think it'd be the best place for him. I'd like for him to get a good education.
Farm workers, unfortunately, were considered just another item in producing products like fertilizer or boxes or water. Most growers didn't treat their workers with any degree of respect or dignity.
The life of a migrant farm worker was harsh. Long days of back-breaking work in the hot sun, exposure to poisonous pesticides, all for substandard wages. Life expectancy was 49 years. Education was usually limited to 2 or 3 years of school because children often had to work in the fields with their parents. The farm worker was trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and illiteracy.
I grew up into an agricultural area that was segregated in a sense that it separated farmers from farm workers, and it separated the races completely.
My family, they were migrant workers, but that is very, very difficult because you absolutely have no control of your living conditions, and there's just no way of knowing what the crop season is going to be like. Just like all my brothers and sisters, and just like most of the people in the community, we all grew up in the fields. The only way that we could really put some roots down and to get an education was to have like a home base, because that was one of the things that we saw, that with the migrant families in particular, that they were pulled out of school all the time and they just really didn't have a chance to get much of an education.
Economic rights are the essence of human rights. First of all, every study shows you that without economic rights, you don't have educational rights. When you are in a rural area, you're very vulnerable, especially if you are living from hand to mouth. There is very little integration of other ideas that's taking place when you're constantly moving. You never form a sense of place. You're constantly worrying if you're going to have enough money to pay for the gas, or you're going to have enough money to buy the food. It's a tremendous feeling of isolation, fear, where a rancher can do almost anything that they want with you.
Past efforts to sustain a union among farm workers in California had failed. In 1964, U.S. officials put a stop to the Bracero program, which had allowed the legal importation of temporary farm workers from Mexico. The end of the Bracero program reduced the workforce available to growers, and California farm labor organizers saw an opportunity. In the summer of 1965, Filipino workers called a wildcat strike against grape growers in the Coachella Valley, 150 miles to the east of Los Angeles.
The strike was won in 1 week because Coachella is a hot country and grapes ripen by the seconds, almost by the seconds. So what you do not pick today, it is ready tomorrow, waiting for us to come in. Come on and pick me, I'm ready.
The Coachella growers quickly gave in to the Filipinos' demand for $1.40 an hour. Now the workers set their sights on the grape harvest to the north, near the town of Delano. With a large Mexican-American workforce available to them, Delano growers refused the Filipinos' demand for a wage increase. Striking Filipinos quickly discovered that they had lost jobs and shelter as well.
Our home was right there in the camps. Growers threw out the belongings of some of those strikers in the camp where they are, outside of the rooms, locked their rooms. We sleep in our cars, under the trees surrounding the community hall.
The Filipinos knew their strike would fail without the support of the NFWA, the National Farm Workers Association, a recently formed organization of Mexican-American farm workers.
Our plan had been to quietly organize like for 5 years and to try to get the whole San Joaquin Valley organized before we even talked about doing anything like a strike. Then when the strike happened, well, everything, just changed.
With the Filipinos on strike, Mexican-Americans now had a decision to make. Most considered it a no-win situation. There was no strike fund. Farm workers had no savings. There was no money to support a walkout for even a few days. In Delano, families lived on a day-to-day basis, constantly on the edge. The strike could be a financial disaster.
To get involved, you had an awful lot to lose because the bosses of the fields were threatening everybody left and right that they would lose their jobs or they would not be hired, or there were even threats of deportation for some of the people who were like more recent arrivals. So it was pretty frightening on that level.
I mean, there were times when people were afraid to meet in their homes, that you had to go meet somewhere else, like in a park or down by the river or something, because they were afraid if somebody would find out and tell the labor contractor or the grower and they would get fired.
The NFWA called a strike meeting to see whether they would officially join the strike. And it was on September 16th, which, as you know, is Mexican Independence Day. And for any good Mexican, September 16th, I mean, we're all feeling full of revolutionary fervor and patriotism, and people started talking about how unfair what the growers were doing and why we needed to fight back. And then a guy gets up and starts talking. I said, oh, that must be Cesar. And he was tall with a mustache, very distinguished looking. I was very impressed. And then he says, now I want to introduce you to Cesar Chavez. And so then Cesar gets up, and he's this little guy, you know, he's very soft-spoken. That's Cesar? You know, I just wasn't very impressed, but the more he talked, the more I thought that not only could we fight, but we could win.
We'll never stop. Our job will not be done until every farm worker is organized.
That was fertile ground. I mean, we were angry. Many of us were afraid. Many of us didn't know what to do. But we were just waiting. We were somebody just waiting for somebody to throw a match. And that's what Cesar did.
El día 8 de septiembre de los campos de Deleno salieron los filipinos. Y después de 2 semanas para unirse a la batalla.
The National Farm Workers Association voted to join the strike. With only $87 in its treasury, union leaders prayed that the work stoppage would be brief. Farm workers tightened their belts and bravely faced an uncertain future. Workers were thinking of the strike in terms of days or even weeks, not years.
My family realized that we weren't going anywhere, that we had a lot at stake, and that we had to basically stay and fight. That even, like my mother said, even if we starved to death, that we would not be alone, but that we had to stay and fight, because otherwise nothing was going to change.
Viva la revolución, arriba con nuestra unión, viva huelga en general.
All I can say is that the men have to be the judges of their own, what they want. And these men have chosen this type of work, just like farming. Anybody will tell you the farmers are taking the poorest of economics, but yet this is my choice. So the same with these workers. They have chosen this way of life, and if they were not happy, they wouldn't be here.
Not all growers were nice people. They just wanted to get their job done. Others were very compassionate to their workers. And so you can't just categorize them all as bad guys or good guys.
We came from a hard-working family, poor people. A lot poorer than a lot of these workers that work for us. Of course, it was a different time, a different period, but we were sympathetic to the working person because we did it.
Most of the growers in the Delano area settled there in the 1920s and 30s. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Every one of these growers, such as my father and others, they were immigrants. They came here with nothing but their hands. And so they were sympathetic to the worker, and they wanted to be fair. What we can't afford, we can't give.
Land was cheap because at the time the valley was a semi-desert, an ideal climate for grapes and other crops requiring year-round attention by farm workers. In 1951, the growers received a windfall when the federal government brought water into the San Joaquin Valley, in effect, subsidizing the growers' irrigation needs. This abundant water supply dramatically increased the valley's yield and transformed small farms into thriving agricultural businesses.
I worked in a lettuce patch when I was 13 years old. It's back-breaking work, and it's hot work, and it's dirty work.
My memories working as a child in the fields would be summarized in long, long hours, hot fields, having to work in hot fields, feeling that that was it, that's what it was gonna be. You know, it was gonna be always working in the fields. You know, we live in horrible conditions. We get paid lousy wages. Our kids don't have any kind of hope of going to college or being something different if they want to be something different.
Basically, we were seen as being ignorant, as being lazy, as being stupid, as being dirty. And that's why we were farm workers. And that's why we were poor.